Hey, it's Dex Gelfand here. And today's talk in the realm of therapeutic spiritual counseling, I'm going to call It's Not Complicated. And what I mean by that is the whole means of understanding all the things that we need to transcend and overcome within our minds and spirits in order to succeed, feel better, and be happier, accomplish our goals. All the things that get in the way of that, they're really very simple. They're all not hard to understand. It's not complicated. And that does lead to the solutions, understanding what these things are, how to go about solving these. And yes, I do have all these available. And after years of practice and experience, I can honestly say that there is no situation, problem, mental mechanism, spiritual hurdle, condition, attitude, or emotional or mental problem or issue that I have not been able to help a person to resolve. And this is having studied, researched a lot of different techniques and processes, many of them coming from my original background in Scientology, and then following the trails and researching into who the individuals were who contributed to the various elements of Scientology that I found useful, and entirely different and other practices that I studied and researched and learned about. But more than anything else, having these past concepts as stepping stones, I arrived at where I could learn the most from just being with you, being with the participant or client, and being honored to be invited to sit with you, with the participant, and for my participants to be open enough to let me into their world and their minds. And we are all empathic. We all have telepathic capabilities. And sometimes we experience these, particularly with people that we are close to. And in the realm of what it is I do that I call therapeutic spiritual counseling, I have opportunity to be very, very close with each of my participants, for them to feel safe enough to just allow the material in their minds and spirits to become available to me. And that is more than just through verbally expressing these things. Once that rapport is established, there's an awful lot I can just see and feel. And through that, I have learned more than the whole sum of the value of what I've learned from the works of many brilliant people that I did learn from and study. For instance, I'm going to speak, a lot of what I'm going to be saying today is, like I'd say 50% of my audience for this is people with Scientology experience. But those people that are open to understanding and transcending beyond the information and the way concepts are laid out in that subject. And that's the primary way a person can learn. I feel like you've really arrived as a counselor when you can simply feel and experience what is happening for the other person and know what to do in the moment based on that. And when you can actually, as needed, adapt, extrapolate, or even newly create a technique in that moment that will be appropriate for what that person is manifesting. I feel I arrived at this point some time ago. And my clients and my participants can vouch for that. You know, there have been times, I remember when a client said, "Can you make up a process that will enable me to do this?" And she mentioned a particular ability. And I said, oh yeah, sure, I can do that. And in that moment, I did, and it worked. That's when you're really there. And what I want to say to you in this talk is that at this point, things have gotten very, very simple. And I can share this very, very simple way of understanding all that we have to deal with within our minds to achieve our goals for how we want to be. There's only a small number of types of mental mechanisms at work here. And I want to say at this point that I feel not like I have a special understanding or view that anybody else couldn't have, or that other people haven't understood things as clearly or even more clearly. But I have the opportunity to share what I have learned, and I do love to do that. I do love to enlighten. I love to be enlightened. And so in that vein, let me also say at this moment that the most valuable ability we have is the ability to change our minds. So even when you or I come with just a brilliant, magnificent, enlightening idea that explains something, we should remain open to dropping that idea or redefining it or reconfiguring it, changing it in some way when we learn more. I don't think you should ever take any principle or technique or any bit of principle or dogma from anything you've ever experienced and hold it in place as immutable, unchangeable. That is always a mistake. And to again refer to one of my favorite quotes, which was still hanging, actually, is still hanging to this day in Thomas Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, which I read when I was 8 years old. I went on a class trip to Thomas Edison's lab in Edison. This saying, which has always served to enlighten me and set me on the path that I'm on. And the quote is this: there is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the true labor of thinking. We all just want to have answers. And then when we have answers, we don't want them questioned. We don't want to have to deal with the unknown or the instability that the ideas or principles that we've locked onto as something to hold on to and feel stable. The idea that these could ever be less than absolutely correct. But every single idea and principle, sooner or later, if you're open to continued growth and enlightenment and learning, then sooner or later every idea or principle comes up for inspection and comes up for the idea that it doesn't explain everything and it isn't perfect. So I think that as we come across bits of information, bits of data, or what might be called a datum, is that we can say that it's a good principle, a good datum, a good piece of information, and that we're going to use that and operate with that idea up until we learn something that transcends it. But if we have the idea that something is absolutely true and hold on to it forever, well, you're going to hit a dead end, and it's not going to explain everything. So I think it's absolutely a must that, including everything I say, of course, anything you could read in any book that comes from any source, any prophet, any god, any genius, any brilliant person, or regardless, we're not perfect. It's not our nature, it's not life to accept anything or anybody as being perfect. It's a mistake. It's like saying, I only want to become so knowledgeable. I only want to get so far, and I don't want to go past that point. It's okay. Go past that point. Be willing to reconsider things. And when I talk about my theme for today, which is, it's not complicated, I was inspired to give this particular talk and explain this idea by something a client of mine said 2 days ago to me. And this is what she learned from me. But getting her perspective on it made me understand how simple this really is. And she said that what she's learned from me is that there are only 4 types of mental mechanisms that we have to contend with. That's all there are. There are only 4. Now I know from Scientology, which I was once very involved in, and I believe that I've outgrown it and kind of evolved and extrapolated, taken into account a lot of other information, re-examined a lot of the information in Scientology, found a lot of it lacking or wanting or incorrect, and questioned everything. And I still recognize that there's a lot of great information available through that, but you have to examine each idea, like with anything else, on its own merits as they seem at this moment, and still be open to look at them newly in the face of new information. But anyway, in Scientology, they have volumes and volumes of information describing all kinds of supposed mental mechanisms and techniques for them. And a lot of the people who actually contributed a lot of these ideas and techniques and principles that L. Ron Hubbard claimed absolute credit for, which I don't like people throwing other people under the bus and not acknowledging them. That's something that's not right. So I will give you some of those names of these people: Alan Walter, John McMaster, John Galusha, Dennis Stevens, Gordon Bell. I'm leaving out a lot of other people. But these particular people were all brilliant people who contributed some of the worthwhile concepts, principles, and techniques that became woven into the quilt that is presented as a unified system called Scientology. And one of the things I ultimately learned from my experience in Scientology, where I was for a good while the lead auditor counselor for the organization in New York City. I was good then. I was good at what I did then. I took a lot of pride and helped a lot of people. But there were a lot of cracks and crevices, and as I've learned later, in my observation and experience, there's a lot that's built into it to kind of keep the hamsters on the treadmill. And there's a lot of misunderstandings woven into it for the point of holding people, keeping them holding on to and being to some degree feeling they need to be dependent on that system and to not question anything in it. And that's just plain wrong. So I'm sorry to my friends who are Scientologists that find that offensive, because it's like Alcoholics Anonymous. There are a lot of things that are less than perfect, like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, preaches the idea that if you're an addict or an alcoholic, you will always be an addict or an alcoholic, and that you must constantly be reinforced, attend group meetings, do certain things, avoid certain things, and recognize you still have these tendencies. That's not a very workable philosophy, in my opinion. And I think every cult does that in its own way. Whether they say you're always going to have this problem, so you're always going to need our help, and you're going to need to become one of us and spread these same attitudes so that you can help other people. But it's a trap. Anything that implies or states that you must always stay with this method or this paradigm, must always do it. And, I don't care if we're talking about mainstream churches, religions, whatever. That's a liability. And it's not honest, and it's not right. I think that the way to the ethical and proper and respectful way to empower other people and to help them is to simply present what you have to offer and let them take from it what they will, and even encourage them to extrapolate and see it their own way, and then reflect on it and contribute to that idea, and then turn around and enlighten you. That's the way I think it should be. And my clients have certainly enlightened me through the years. If it was just by sharing what they were experiencing in the moment, or sharing their observations and reflecting on what they learned from me, as my client did a couple of days ago, when she put it in the perspective of what she learned from me, is that there are only 4 basic mechanisms there to be conquered. And these mechanisms come up there, again and again. There's any number of mechanism A, any number of mechanism B, etc. Okay, so now, in terms of it's not complicated, let's get to what these 4 mechanisms are. And this isn't anything I haven't said before, but it's summarized and made much simpler when you understand that's all there is. There's just these 4 mechanisms. And again, like for instance, in Scientology, there's this this idea that you ascend through various levels, and you handle or approach or deconstruct different mental mechanisms and mental traps as you rise upward through their levels. God, people are such a sucker for the idea of levels. Levels make you feel like you're better than somebody else, or you're better than you were before. You know how you can tell when you're better than you were before? When your life is better, when you feel better. That's all there is to go by. Forget the idea that you were at level 2 and now you're at level 7, so look how far you've come. Meaningless. That requires a whole lot of group reinforcement, and that makes it false. Again, just like AA, to give another example. All that group reinforcement that seems necessary to keep you on the path, okay? The truth is that you don't really need to ascend to some higher level in order to address successfully any of these 4 mechanisms. That's been proven out in thousands and thousands of hours in sessions that I've given people of all backgrounds and all conditions, and Scientologists. I have had plenty of clients who had just a scratch on the surface of all the processing available through Scientology. I have other clients that have done the entire bridge of Scientology. And you know what? They all respond the same way to the same techniques. I'm sorry. Well, not exactly the same way, but more or less, So in terms of Scientologists who have done their entire levels of the Scientology bridge, I will say that while there are more than a few times when somebody has a wonderful, brilliant change through the processes of Scientology, it's kind of hit or miss, with these pre-programmed levels where everybody goes through the same things. You might hit the target, and you would hope that sometimes you will on things, but what I wanted to say is that the clients I've had that have come to me after having done everything there is to offer in Scientology, because it's a directed path, and it doesn't just have you sit there and explain what's on your mind and address what that is right now, a lot of it never really gets resolved. And so when I have clients who have done the entire system, OT, 8, L12 are the designations. The common statement that these clients make after 1 or 2 or 3 sessions with me is, I can't believe that I finally resolved the very issue that I got into Scientology in the first place, hoping and expecting to actually fix. Of course, because we're actually just addressing that, not saying it'll show up somewhere in what we're doing if you just keep the hamsters on the treadmill. Anyway, so what are these 4 mechanisms that enable us to say, or enable me to tell you, it's not complicated? The whole system of dealing with one's mental mechanisms and issues, it's not complicated. Okay, here we go, the 4 mechanisms. Not in any particular order, but we have the stubbornly held protective attitude. Okay, Scientologists, in your realm, this is somewhat superficially called a service facsimile. And the definition and understanding of it is very superficial. What a stubbornly held protective attitude is, it's where a person makes a very firm decision that holds certain things in place that actually prevent them from being happy, accessing their full abilities, being able to experience much of life, and being able to do. Okay? And a stubbornly held protective attitude comes about from having encountered something very overwhelming, very, very defeating, and very painful, and very scary, that has, there's fear involved in it. And so the person feels a need to come up with something to protect themselves from experiencing whatever this occurrence or condition might be that was so devastating, so that they don't ever have to directly wrestle with it. And that's what a stubbornly held protective attitude is. I created that phrase, that term, stubbornly held protective attitude because it's so self-descriptive. Makes it easier to understand. And you see this in other people. You may even catch it in yourself, but we all have these, including all of you Scientologists who supposedly wiped out your service facsimiles on your grade 4 of your Scientology experience. I have never met a single person ever, of course myself included, okay, who's not walking around with some stubbornly held protective attitudes, these like mental fixed solutions that say, this is why I'm not going to experience or connect with this particular subject or thing or whatever condition or whatever it is. And every stubbornly held protective attitude, it has a real sense of stubbornness in it. It has a sense of irritation and antagonism in it. And underlying that is a fear, okay? And by the way, I'm going to share something else with you and give this some thought. But rage or anger is almost always, if not always, something that is generated to bury fear or try to hide or dismiss fear. The basis of anger is to try to suppress and bury fear. Wow, when I finally came to observe that that's what's going on in people, that was big. Essentially everything that we need to process. And when I say process, think of it as digesting food in your stomach until it's really digested. If there's a digestion problem and something's in there, it's painful. It stays with you forever until in some way, shape, or form it's digested. That's exactly what we're addressing with what I call therapeutic spiritual counseling, in the sense of doing processing. It's spiritual, mental, emotional digesting. It's where I will say sometimes to just completely relax yourself. Be completely effortless. And this thing that you're talking about that you, quote unquote, can't live with, can't experience, it's your resistance to digesting that and just having that within you that holds it in place. And you have to think of it as almost like it's a living thing that is just suffering from a need to express itself and be heard, and if you just have some way of just relaxing and being effortless and letting that which is within you fully express and exhaust itself and just be allowed and accepted, when that happens, it's gone. It no longer feels a need to express anymore. It's been heard. Think of it that way. That's what processing really is. Okay, it's a form of emotional / spiritual / mental digestion. And yes, the solution to everything that you feel you can't approach within your mind is to let it be within you and stop resisting it. And yes, that's why most of us need the context of a session of therapeutic spiritual counseling or something to, at least to some degree, accomplish that. So that's the first mechanism, what I just called stubbornly held protective attitudes. And I have evolved a specific technique, a series of steps that completely dissolves this particular mechanism. And like every other mechanism, the other three, all of these are held in place by your own decision at some time to create or accept it. And so part of resolving any of these things is to fully examine the consequences of them, what they were intended to protect you from, and then mindfully doing this, consciously reevaluating that decision so that you can then actually withdraw such decisions that hold bad things in place. Okay, so the next of these four mechanisms, again in no particular order, is the false me, the identities we assume, the false me's, the personas, the personae that we take on. Okay, and taking on a personae is a means of withdrawing from that which we feel we can't confront and experience, and putting something else, a false me, in place of that, in place of just being in the moment and being present, That is the most basic reason for a persona, an identity. And so these become substitute me's, and their purpose of them can be to protect us from some perceived danger or fear. Very commonly, these are to get a kind of attention that we want to have, or to get any attention at all, or to feel loved, or to be loved, or to get sympathy, or to seem dangerous, to seem to get obedience or admiration from others. But again, these tend to be born out of a fear of what people will do to us if we don't create such a persona. It's interesting to me that so many participants start out with, they're trying to find out who they are, who they should be, but they're really looking for a thing that will define them. And any such idea that you have a particular personality, it could very well be rooted in the idea that you are not yet at a point where you can feel safe and powerful enough and happy just simply being, rather than being something or somebody or some particular self or me. And any of these, any identity, any persona that we take on or that we have imposed upon us has tremendous liabilities in that it filters everything through the perceptive and creative filters of the identity. And so there's so much we cannot allow ourselves to experience because we've taken on a particular persona, and we all have many of these. And a persona and a stubbornly held protective attitude have a lot of similarities. They're not entirely dissimilar. They're both essentially attitudes that are taken on for protective reasons. But the persona is a much more developed, much more complex filter and substitute for presence than a stubbornly held protective attitude. But it would be correct to say that all personae that we take on, all identities that we take on, are a form of stubbornly held protective attitudes, whereas it would not be correct to say that all stubbornly held protective attitudes are identities. I guess that's the best way to sum up the differences. So that's the second mechanism, the persona that we take on, the many false me's. It's very easy to see this in other people, that they go around, with some false personality all the time. It can be very obvious. It's not so obvious to see it in ourselves, but it becomes extremely simple to see it in ourselves. In the context of a therapeutic spiritual counseling session, when I just ask you to name the persona that you take on, it comes right up. I have the techniques to undo these. It doesn't mean that you can't, when you consciously, in a moment when you feel like this is what I should be in this moment, that you wouldn't be able to do that. But you just wouldn't be stuck with it as a unconsciously self-replicating mechanism that takes over your consciousness. That you don't want. And one more thing about identities or personas is that there's two basic means of finding ourselves encumbered in a persona. One of those is when we primarily kind of create or take it on for ourselves for some reason. The other, and this is more common than you would possibly think, is when we're affected by how others see us, and they are projecting onto us the persona that they are creating us as being. That goes on all the time. It's the definition of how people relate to each other, by the way. The projecting of personas. So in terms of, yes, I have the techniques to dismantle these things so that they're not controlling us. But the key question to ask in terms of which technique to use is to determine whether primarily any particular persona is something you've taken on as a solution to something or other, or whether you found it imposed on you in how you and another person related to each other. The techniques for resolving these are different depending on the answer to that question. Although ultimately there still remains that at some point a person makes a decision to accept that which is being projected onto them, or to to take on, adopt whatever persona or identity is currently dominating their consciousness. Okay, so that's two of the four mechanisms. The stubbornly held protective attitude and the identity or persona. So the other two mechanisms kind of relate to each other in a similar sense of how stubbornly held protective attitudes and identities relate to each other. So one of these yet to be mentioned mechanisms is simply what's called a condition. A condition is a negative feeling and attitude and worry or something like that kind of is always present somewhere in our consciousness to greater or lesser degree. It's a big problem, and whatever somebody's complaining of could be described in a very general sense as a condition. And any condition can be successfully resolved, digested, and processed. And essentially what it is, it's just simply energy. It's energy of a specific frequency, depending on whether it's anxiety and what degree and type of anxiety, fear, terror, whatever, sadness, depression, apathy, anger, whatever it is. But from what I see, some form of fear is essentially the most dominant essence of most unwanted conditions that need to be resolved. Now, throughout history, there have been many approaches to resolving conditions. Going back to the late 1800s and into the 1900s with Freud, who was preceded by Joseph Breuer and whoever else came before that, this idea that trauma stays with us from earlier moments in life, and that the way one resolves their conditions is by basically by processing the particular incidents, the particular traumas that a person has experienced. And that's what Dianetics is actually based on, which Scientology kind of grew out of. I believe that the most effective form of Dianetics was back in 1950, when it just asked more general questions and allowed the mind to simply go where it needs to go. What I call your spiritual compass. If invited to, it will offer up exactly what it is the person needs to address and examine. But there's an overemphasis in Dianetics and in Scientology and in psychotherapy and Freudian and other techniques, all of which involve the idea of directly going to earlier incidents to relieve trauma. It has great value, actually. It does have great value. But what I find the issue is like the theme of this talk, it's not complicated. Again, what it really is, it's just simply energy, the energy of anxiety, the energy of fear. And whether you're going to a psychoanalyst or a Dianetics practitioner, the stress is on finding incidents that explain things. But let me say this, these incidents that have this energy that links the incidents together, the same kind of feeling or sensation, that feeling or sensation is exactly what needs to be processed. It's an energy of itself, and that energy can, the clay of that energy can be shaped into whatever concept the person is being indoctrinated into. So yes, you can find earlier incidents that seem to explain things, but truthfully, a lot of that is using a technique that is based in indoctrinating the person to first shape their energy and see it and project it as being whatever the form of these things is described as being in whatever the particular therapy paradigm is. For instance, in Dianetics, it's the idea that you find something, and if it doesn't completely resolve, you find an earlier incident. You find an earlier incident. It's very linear, and it's very sequential, time sequential. And it's just a matter of pulling the plug at the base of all of these incidents with the most earliest and basic incident. And what's interesting, that has varying degrees of workability. It can almost always result in epiphanies for the individual just because they're discovering new information about their lives and their existence. And that will result in at least some of that feeling, at least temporarily, seeming to be gone. But ultimately, what works best and what is most direct is to simply invite you to just experience, allow the energies to be within you instead of resisting them, and just see them for however they manifest in your mind, without being indoctrinated to see them as time sequential incidents or alien entities who have subsumed your consciousness. And yes, that's part of the Scientology paradigm and several others as well that I know of. And again, all of this amounts to artificially, externally, getting some concept or principle or dogma that everything is explained by shaping the clay of these energies to fit the form of the principles that one is being indoctrinated into. Ultimately, the whole idea of your issues, your emotional barriers, these mental mechanisms being related in the sense of, or essentially being incidents that happened in a sequential order, and therefore you've got to go in a specific sequential order to resolve them and just go earlier. It's based on what I would say from a broader spiritual context is a very artificial thing that we all come to accept, which is the idea that time is a linear and sequential thing. Well, maybe it's not. I mean, if you look at quantum physics and other more essential and basic descriptions or understandings of existence, time is a very arbitrary thing, and that there are theories of principles of physics that actually work out, that explain that everything is actually happening at the same time, and that it's not even at the same time is a superficial way of saying it, because the very idea of time is to say that things happen somewhere in a sequential stream continuum. So there's actually, that itself can be considered to be simply a created way of looking at life, and not necessarily self-evident or necessarily in a basic truth that would stand without first agreeing to it. Think about that. So, and what's interesting to me is that one of the best means of successfully addressing these unwanted conditions is a technique in Scientology that was developed in 1965 that's called power processing. Now, I've since extrapolated from that, changed it, and created forms of it that are actually more essential, more basic, more truer, and more helpful. But power processing was actually based on the idea that rather than Scientology's and Dianetics principles, that the way to address unwanted conditions is by simply going earlier to a similar thing, earlier to a similar incident, and then earlier to a similar incident. And that what power processing does, and we say similar, again, that really amounts to the same energy, the same emotion, the same feeling. And that's what really makes them similar. Anyway, what they came up with 1965, power processing, as the person who was the main developer of power processing, a very, very wonderful being named John McMaster. His understanding of it was relative to Scientology's idea of things being time sequential, earlier, similar. On the time track was that in power processing, he describes one cycles on the time track. Cycles on the track is meaning that instead of the basic Freudian psychotherapeutic and Dianetics approach of earlier to similar till you come to a basic incident that's supposed to explain it all and make it all go away. That in this power processing, which proved to be so much more effective, is that you ask for a condition and just continue over and over to ask for the condition and see what comes up. And the person will go backward and forward in time. He won't go linear. Without being directed to do so, a person will not go earlier. They will allow their spiritual compass, which is your basic instinct for your mind and soul, to present exactly what needs to be addressed in whatever sequence it needs to be addressed in, which is not in any direction of linear time, as power processing proved out. Okay, what they called cycling on the track. Now, it seems to me that L. Ron Hubbard and John McMaster and other people didn't fully get, or didn't want to get, or suppressed the idea that the way power processing worked actually disproved that Dianetics was essentially true and factual. Even though it had a certain limited workability, it was not, the principles of it were not true and factual. Because power processing proved that you don't need to direct a person to go earlier, and always in the earlier direction. And that is not the natural resolution of conditions. Because when allowing the spiritual compass, allowing what is within you to just process and accept what comes up next. Because with anything in existence that is perfect, it is your own spiritual compass. It will present exactly what it needs to examine next. If it's not being misdirected by some counselor who has his own indoctrinated ideas of what the participant should be looking at, which is very disempowering, which is my basic argument with things like Dianetics and Scientology. You ask a more general question like, what's on your mind? Close your eyes. What are you seeing now? What are you feeling now? Okay? As opposed to telling them where and when in time they should be looking, or what exactly they should be looking for. That is very disempowering. It is misleading. And while it does lead to finding new information about oneself, it is far from the most efficient and effective way of helping the person to resolve what they themselves want to resolve and what they themselves are interested in resolving and in understanding. Okay? So any technique or practice that subsumes the person's own natural direction of what to think about and what to address has a great liability in it. And that's why people can spend decades and fully invest themselves into some spiritual or psychological paradigm and then one day walk away from it and see it as all being wrong because it violated the first rule of spirituality and spiritual enlightenment, enhancement, and evolution. The first rule, which is trust your own instincts. Take what comes from you and be willing to sit with it and have it and process it. Take your own direction. There is nothing more individualistic than spirituality practiced correctly. So, again, this all comes from the third mechanism we're describing, which is conditions. Okay? So, the three discussed mechanisms so far. We have the stubbornly held protective attitude, number one. The persona or identity, number two. And what we've just discussed, the unwanted condition, which is troubling and always hovering within the person and making them feel certain things they don't want to feel, which is number three. And again, these numbers are purely arbitrary. They're not in any particular order of importance or which comes first. There's no particular order. So the one remaining, we will call number four, is the moment of shock. And the moment of shock is related to conditions. But the moment of shock is a very intense burst of painful energy that the person experiences through something that occurs in their life. And there are many of these moments of shock. And they're so overwhelming that ordinary psychological techniques or the techniques of Dianetics or the techniques that I use to resolve a condition will not be enough to fully unearth a moment of shock. A moment of shock is collapsing. A moment of shock, like any condition, any unwanted condition basically floats through the time continuum with the person and never quite goes away. But a moment of shock is more dominant in how it stays with the person, and how it's always hovering just within the gray area of consciousness, if not being even more present than just that gray area of consciousness. The moment of shock is something that if you just said to the person, okay, go into that moment, recall that moment of shock and just process it, they couldn't do it. It's too painful, it's too overwhelming. It takes more of a specific, gradual series of steps that approach it from different aspects to gradually open it up and make it more experienceable, taking on one aspect of it at a time to process. The moment of shock, we're all walking around with these. And the moment of shock is the absolute thing that the person most feels they can never do anything about. And it will be with them forever. People define themselves by these moments of shock very often. They're the person that lost their mother, or whatever it might be. And I recently did a lecture about the liability of defining oneself by their moments of shock. But that's what happens. And so this relates to the mechanism of the persona or the identity, because this is one way that we take on a persona or identity. The person whose wife died right in front of them, and they define themselves by that moment. And they can't quite shake it, and it's always there. In how they present themselves and define themselves as being to other people, to a great part, is the person who had this particular moment of shock, had this particular horrible experience. And we go into the whole subject of the identity or the persona through this avenue. It's also true that personas are taken on as an attempt to protect oneself from conditions as well. So you see how these things interrelate. A person stuck with a moment of shock, as we all actually have some of these, is going to define themselves by that moment of shock. They're going to rate stubbornly held protective attitudes that say, don't have anything to do with whatever the thing is that is a subject related to the moment of shock. So these four mechanisms are all interrelated. And what I do in sessions as a therapeutic spiritual counselor is I can sense what is present for the person at this moment. And you're always concerned with now, with this moment. And the fact is, the condition, the moment of shock, the stubbornly held protective attitude, and the persona or identity, these can emerge and be present, shifting from one to the other as processing takes place. And a good practitioner has to be able to shift with them. By the way, that's a firm and hard rule in Scientology training, is to never change with the piece. You never change with the client. Hold your ground, make them do what you want them to do. The only rationale I can see for indoctrinating people who would be counselors in that idea is not trusting them to ever arrive as a master practitioner who can know in the moment exactly what needs to be done, but they need to follow the game plan all the way through instead, which is where the counselor stops being really present with the participant. And to some degree, that is disempowering. It is disempowering, and it is why these paradigms like AA or Scientology, so many other things, will more often than not in the long run never get the person where they themselves want to be, because they indoctrinate in every counselor and in every participant that where they feel they need to go, what they feel they need to address, is not to be trusted. What's to be trusted is what some other person put on a sheet of paper and put in lectures and said, this is what you must do. And anytime you stop being in the moment and being present, and instead fall back on substituting an identity of this is the way a counselor behaves, this is the policy of the counselor, that the policy that the practitioner operates on, and put that out there instead of just being with the client and being able to experience the client and help them to be able to experience whatever is coming up for them. You know, that if you do the opposite of that and hold to the ground, that the counselor must maintain control over everything and tell the participant what to think about and where to go, instead of simply encouraging them to go where they fear to go, but yet is where their mind is taking them. That's exactly where they need to go. So I guess I'm doing a lot of digressing here, but I find it important. But to come back to the main subject and the point of this talk, it's not complicated. It's not complicated at all. For all the talk about mental mechanisms and ways you can define things and names you can give things and principles of psychoanalysis and meditation and Scientology and this, that, and the other thing. And these things can be expressed, of course, in other words than the way I'm expressing them. But I try to give these things names that explain what they are. The moment of shock, the persona or identity, the stubbornly held protective attitude, and the unwanted conditions. Those are the four things. I'll say that one more time. The only four mechanisms there are to be processed, to be dismantled, to be discovered, and to be liberated from. Four things. The stubbornly held protective attitude, the persona or identity, the unwanted conditions, and the moments of shock. That's all there is. And with enough experience and observation, those of us who have the passion to help other people in this way can learn to recognize these, and the techniques for resolving them exist. But one needn't feel overwhelmed or confused by the subject of spirituality or psychology or mental or emotional healing, or whatever terms you've come to recognize it as, to resolve one's issues, to become more one's true self, to be liberated from worries and problems and things that don't feel like you should have to have them within you. There's just those four items. That's all there is. Stubbornly held protective attitudes, false personas, false me's or identities, the moments of shock that stay with us, and the feelings and energies of the unwanted conditions that we contend with, that we have within us. That's all there is. It's not complicated. And I, among others, can help you to feel free and have someone sitting with you who understands, who can help you to just experience and process these things and integrate all your experience into one self and one life, and thereby be able to draw on everything without being inhibited or controlled by anything within you, anything you've ever saw or done or experienced. That is the essence of therapeutic spiritual counseling. It's not complicated. I hope you enjoyed this talk.